We hear it all the time. The age of oil is coming to an end. But a recent outlook from the Norwegian energy company Aker BP, well, it paints a very, very different picture for the next 10 years. So in this explainer, we're going to break down their report and see exactly why they think oil's story is far from over.
The story we all know is pretty straightforward, right? Electric cars are everywhere, there's this huge global push for renewables, and it just feels like we have to be on the brink of peak oil demand. That moment when the world's need for oil finally starts to drop for good. But what if that moment is actually a lot further away than we've been led to believe?
And boom, right there, Aker BP just throws a massive curveball. Their main claim, after digging through all the global data, is that oil demand isn't peaking. In fact, they say it's going to keep growing for at least another decade. This flies in the face of the popular narrative. So let's get into it and unpack how they actually got to this conclusion.
And the numbers here are pretty staggering. The report is forecasting that by 2035, global oil demand is going to hit around 11 million barrels every single day. Now, to give you some perspective, today we're at about 104 million. So this isn't things leveling off. We're talking about continued steady growth.
Okay, so the first place you'd expect to see oil demand drop is on our roads, right? That's the sector everyone points to when they talk about switching away from fossil fuels. Let's see what the report has to say about our cars, trucks, and buses.
I mean, this is the big one, isn't it? We see more and more EVs on the road every single day. You'd think that has to be making a huge dent in how much gasoline we use. Well, turns out the real story is a little more complicated than that.
And this visual from the report really spells it out. So yes, they do expect oil demand from road transport to peak. They're actually pinpointing the year 2029. But look at what happens after that peak. It's not a cliff, it's not some dramatic drop-off. It's a really gentle slope. Aker BP calls it a peak and plateau, which means demand stays pretty high for a long time instead of just crashing.
So why is the decline so slow? Well, one of the biggest reasons the report points to is that sales of battery electric vehicles, while they're definitely growing, just aren't keeping up with some of the really aggressive predictions from a few years back. For 2025, they're actually tracking about 8% behind schedule. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but over years, it adds up and has a massive impact.
And the report breaks down why this is happening. In Europe and the US, some government subsidies are being scaled back. In China, the market, which was red hot, is starting to cool off a bit as they reduce tax breaks. Then you've got two other huge factors. One, the gasoline cars already on the road last for a really long time. And two, long-haul trucking. The trucks that move almost everything we buy is still almost completely reliant on diesel.
All right, so if the biggest oil-guzzling sector in the world is hitting a plateau, where on earth is all this new growth supposed to come from? The answer, according to the report, lies in some surprising places that we don't really think about when we're at the gas pump.
The report points to two absolutely massive global industries that are becoming the new engines for oil demand. And here they are. First up, aviation. No big surprise there. As more people around the world travel, the demand for jet fuel just keeps climbing. But the real story here, the absolute behemoth, is petrochemicals. Look at that growth. It's forecast to jump by over 5 million barrels per day. That one sector alone basically cancels out a huge part of the EV transition.
So what in the world are petrochemicals? It's a fantastic question. Think of them as the fundamental building blocks made from oil and gas that are used to create, well, just about everything in modern life. The plastics in your laptop and phone, fertilizers for our food, the synthetic fabrics in our clothes, all that packaging, medical equipment. Seriously, the list just goes on and on. This demand is woven so deeply into our economy that it's incredibly hard to replace. Okay, let's zoom out for a second. This whole story about oil demand isn't just about different industries. It's also a story about different parts of the world that are moving at completely different paces. And this, right here, this simple idea is probably one of the most important things to grasp to understand what's coming in the next decade. The way we experience the energy transition in, say, North America or Europe is totally different from how it's playing out in South Asia or Africa. This chart from the report, wow, it tells the entire story with just 2 lines. That blue line represents the developed nations, what we call OECD countries. You can see their oil demand is basically flat, maybe even declining a little. But then look at the red line. Those are the emerging non-OECD economies. And that is a story of powerful, unstoppable growth. Pretty much all of the net growth in oil demand for the entire planet is coming from this part of the world. So what's driving all this? It's two of the most powerful forces in economics: more people and more economic growth. The report is basically built on the idea that billions of people are going to keep joining the global middle class. And as their incomes rise, they're going to want things like cars, air conditioning, air travel, and all sorts of consumer goods, all of which, as we've seen, are directly linked to oil demand.
All right, so let's try to bring all these different pieces together. When you combine the plateau in transportation, the huge growth in petrochemicals, and this massive divide between different economies, what does the next 10 years actually look like?
I think this visual really captures how complex this whole thing is. Over on the right, in green, you've got sectors like passenger cars that are clearly in transition. But then on the left, you have things like aviation and petrochemicals, where oil demand is what they call sticky. And it's sticky because right now, there just aren't any other viable large-scale alternatives. And here's the whole 10-year forecast in a nutshell. We start with EV sales running a bit behind schedule. Then we hit a peak for passenger cars in 2029, and for trucks a year later in 2030. But even with those peaks, the growth from all those other sectors is so strong that it pushes the total demand all the way up to that 112 million barrels a day mark by 2035.
So look, if there's one big thing to take away from this Aker BP outlook, it's this. Thinking about the energy transition like it's a single light switch that we're all going to flip at the same time is just wrong. It's a really messy, complicated process. Different parts of our economy and different parts of the world are all moving at completely different speeds. And understanding that nuance is the key to seeing what the next decade really holds. This analysis gives us a pretty detailed map for the next 10 years, but it also leaves us with an even bigger question. If this is what the 2030s look like, what does that mean for the decades that come after? It suggests that the road ahead is a lot more complex and maybe a lot longer than many of us might have thought.